topic of my subject this morning is war. The doctrines of the church tell us, as do the scriptures for the church today, that we're opposed to war, carnal warfare. But war is an inevitable fact of life, isn't it? There's no way we can seem to get around it. The situation as we see it. And I don't mean to point at Los Angeles and speak of that as a war, because that's not a war. That's anarchy in its highest degree. That's not really war. War is a planned effort on two parties to wage combat, and the victor takes all, so to speak. This is not war, what we see on the news on the West Coast and in other places. That's a different thing. But war itself is inevitable. The life of every individual here in some way, shape, or form has been affected by past wars. And if the age continues and Jesus doesn't come, we can be sure that our lives will again be affected by wars and rumors of wars. Any of us who have been involved in the military, we know that war is the greatest example of organized confusion that there ever was. That's exactly the correct way to term it. It's organized, and once it gets in motion, it's just total chaos. You don't know where you are, and you don't know where the next fella is either. The group that was supposed to be on your right, all of a sudden they're not there. You try to establish contact and you don't see anybody. And so when it comes down to it, you just don't know even which way the enemy is at. And in reality, the reason for such confusion is the author of confusion, Satan himself. Because he has, in certain ways, orchestrated much of the conflict that we see about us. And so it's only going to result in the greatest of confusion there ever was. In my experiences, I was never in any conflict, but there was an incident that took place up on the Russian border that we were supposed to be patrolling. And a young lieutenant came up and he was guiding his platoon, and the next thing you know, it comes over the air, he's lost. And he can't find where he's at. And he's within 2 miles or so of Russian guns. And here nothing had even taken place, and already confusion was ensuing on this poor young fellow. And you could tell as it came over the radio that the poor man was really in straits, hard times. But of course he eventually got straightened out in more ways than one. In the last year, we saw the 100-hour war. As precise as things did go, it's still amazing at the amount of confusion that took place on that battlefield. I think the greatest example is the one that showed the video of this pilot. Wasn't sure if it was friendly or enemy, and he got permission to fire anyway, and at the instant he made his target, it was found out that it was friendly. And so we have friendly fire. Even under the most strictest of conditions and all the technology, Satan is still in there, and confusion is very prevalent. And when it comes to warfare, there are no real winners. That warfare as we know it now. I'm speaking of as we have seen it in our lifetimes and as we have experienced it. There are no real winners. Everybody loses in some way, shape, or form. Yeah, there is a victor, that's true. But the cost is beyond comprehension. Even the lives of those who were victorious are affected for the rest of their life in some way, shape, or form from those events that took place on the battlefield. Today, God uses these wars to fulfill His will. He doesn't say that one must go to war, but He uses these things. Despite all the confusion and everything, the end result in some way, shape, or form is the fulfilling a prophecy that God has already outlined in His holy word. But in the deepest sense, God is opposed to the wars that are being conducted upon this earth in this age and in this time. But there was a time, and now we're going to go back in history to a time before any of us were here, to a time when the nation of Israel was taken out of Egypt, and the great Exodus took place, and a time when the Holy Land that was promised to Israel had to be taken. There was a time when God did involve Himself in the certain conflicts, and when He did fight and was well known as a fierce fighter for His people. This is not the kind of war that we think of today. It's a totally different situation, and circumstances are not even close to what we experience. I'm going to use the term holy war when it comes to this kind of a conflict because it's separate from what we're involved in or what we see. And the scriptures are very plain when it comes to God directing and suggesting that one nation or His people go to war. The Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation, it says in Exodus 17 and verse 16. That's because of what Amalek did to the children of Israel. And it says here that the Lord will have this war. Continuing, it says in another text that the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, avenge the children of Israel of the Midianites, Numbers 31, verses 1 and 2. There can be no question in these incidences, or in these circumstances, that God was going to direct the children of Israel to military operations against the enemy. There can be no question about that. This war was sanctioned by Him, and He was going to fight for His people. It was disastrous for the enemy. Israel suffered no losses when they fought on God's side totally. Now, as we go into my words and my thoughts this morning, we'll get more into it. The only ones who would lose their life were those who may have had a certain degree of unbelief in their heart, because it required a total commitment to go into combat with God. The enemy had no chance. And so we have what is called a holy war, and it is different. And there are certain aspects as I got into the studies of this that I ran across, and I'd like to share those thoughts with you this morning concerning a holy war. Preparation. Every conflict has a preparation. There has yet to be an operation undertaken that did not require some sort of preparation. And this brings me to a thought. There's a verse, or a couple of times it's mentioned in the scriptures. It says, when the year had expired and the kings go forth to battle. Some of you have read this in your Old Testament. And I kind of took notice of this. And one of the notes that I ran across in the studies was that it was always in the spring of the year when military operations were started. They didn't start in October or November, but it was always in the spring of the year when the kings go forth to battle. And it was kind of interesting because that is carried clear back to the time of Abraham, when Lot was taken. And Abraham went after the kings in the valley, or in the vale. And it was at that same time of year when the kings go forth to battle. And what made it most interesting to me, and I'm touching on a slightly different subject for a moment, but it's as interesting, that we partake of the Lord's Supper on the 14th day of the first month at spring. When the kings go forth to battle was after the equinox, and the first month had started of the year. Though it may not have been the exact same day, because the Bibles don't say, but it certainly puts it within a couple of days of the 14th day of the first month that Abraham met Melchizedek after that battle. It's a thought to think about. Showing, in a sense of the word, a continuity of the 14th day of the first Bible month of each year to be that time that he met him with the emblems. And I thought that was a little interesting side note as this study was before me. But in the preparation, there had to be the approval and the commitment of God in the preparation of the Holy War. The Lord always had to be involved. He had to be asked about it, and his approval had to be given. Consultation with God was necessary through various means. And they are through dreams. There's examples of this. The Urim, the ephod, when David consulted God through that way, or the words of the prophet of God himself would come and give the instructions that, yes, it is time to take these people out, or it is time to go after that nation. Generally speaking, when Israel became a nation and in their own land, any defense of Israel territory against foreign invasion automatically constituted a holy war. This was God-given land to Israel. And so if an invader came in, generally speaking now, I'm not making it unequivocally or without exceptions, but generally speaking, that constituted a holy war to defend that land. Aren't they doing that today, in a sense? It's too bad they're not giving him the credit for what victories they do have. It's amazing, isn't it? But that constituted a holy war. The only exception to this would be if the invader was permitted by God because of Israel's transgressions. Now we have it on a different footing. Now we start to see something here that is God's will, and those who follow God's will, and the outcome because of it. In the book of Judges, we have both examples. We have examples where God routed the enemy out of the land, and Israel became victorious. And we also have examples where the enemy came in and brought upon Israel heavy destruction because of her transgressions. From preparation in a holy war, we go to personnel, people. The military commander did not lead in his own name or in his own genius. You know, today we give Schwarzkopf a lot of credit for what he did. Not the case when God's people were fighting in the time of Israel. The commander was prepared for his office by a special gift of the Spirit of God. And by the virtue of this gift, he held his command. A couple of examples would be Gideon, a very good example. And his army was narrowed down to 300 men, wasn't it? And those men, with Gideon as their spirit-led commander, wrought great havoc upon the enemy. Another example in the 11th chapter of Judges is Jephthah and his fight and in his command. But these men did it for the glory of God, and they were led by God in their efforts and in all their military operations. If for any reason the Spirit was withdrawn from the commander, his authority to lead went with it immediately. The best Bible example we're all familiar with that was Saul, wasn't it? But the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul. When he went his way and turned from God and started on his own devices, then he lost the Spirit of God and that special gift to lead the army. As to the soldiers in the army, the requirement there was that for every person had to be completely single-minded. There could be no distractions. So in a sense of the word, as you look into certain of these things, and even in the scriptures, you'll find it became an honor to serve in this army. It wasn't something that you were drafted into it, whether you liked it or not, or you just gotten married or not, you were going to go to war. No, there were certain exceptions. And they would expel a person or let him go if he was married recently, or if there were certain other distractions that the person might have. They were asked to leave the camp. So only those who remained had a total commitment to this effort. And it took that to be successful, because then God could work. In the 20th chapter of Deuteronomy, and I'm not going to read it because really it involves the whole chapter, but we have here, the note suggests the law of warfare. But here are reasons given why individuals would not serve in their campaigns, and some of the conditions that were involved. And so we find the commander and his army and the preparation. The conduct of the war is the next point that I would like to cover. For the conduct of a holy war, numbers meant little or nothing. And again, we can think of Gideon and certain others. For the Lord fights for the army. And we read this in quotes. For the Lord your God is he that goeth with you to fight for you against your enemies, to save you. In Deuteronomy 20 and verse 4, that's the same chapter. There are numerous examples of God using a small number to vanquish thousands and hundreds of thousands. There's the example of David going against Goliath. A youth. By all military standards, this is total stupidity. This isn't even close to reason. But God was with David, and his Spirit inspired David to do what he did. And the Spirit guided that stone that smote Goliath and put him down. Another example to think of, amongst the others, would be Samson. He slew 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone, a mule or a donkey, so to speak. You don't do this with natural human strength. You can't even comprehend it. 1,000 people taken down. Who was it that slew those? It wasn't the striking of that bone. It was God that struck those people down. Oh yes, he made the moves with his weapon. But the death was brought down by God himself, because no man can strike down 1,000 people in his front. That's impossible. So God fought with Samson at this time, as long as Samson was faithful. He had that gift. The outcome of a holy war? Well, if it's done according to God's will, and everyone is properly in their place, there is no question as to the outcome of this conflict. It will be won. Totally. There's a story that makes I think of, we've read it's in the Apocrypha. And it's a story where Israel fought against its enemies, those who were faithful. And after the campaign was over, they were not used to losing people, and they lost 9 men. Now, by our standards today, that's not even reasonable either. They lost 9 men and were wondering why 9 men were lost. They were used to total and complete victory. Why did we lose these 9 men? They met the qualifications. They were in the camp. Something was wrong. But they found, when they went to examine these 9 men, that on their persons, inside their coats or someplace on their body, was found a little idol. A little something that was not God's will. And therefore they lost their lives. The rest of the army never sustained a scratch, so to speak, or they were not harmed, injured, or killed. We don't go to battle today with those kind of thoughts in mind. No way can we do that today. The nations of this world are not backed by God's Spirit in general. And so we have these major points, if you will, concerning a holy war as it is found in the Scriptures. Historically speaking, the times of holy war were most prominent from the time of the Exodus through Israel's establishment in their promised land. This is when it was at its high peak, you might say. God was with his people continuously. The leaders were following God's will, and were doing God's will for the most part. There are some exceptions there also, but in general, this was the high point of what we could say are these holy wars. But as time goes on and years progress, we find that Israel, as we all know, fell into transgression, didn't they? And so things began to change. After David, we find the conditions really accelerating into a corrupt situation. God no longer fought for Israel the way he did before. After David, things took a very definite change. And also, the prophets of God started to speak against these conflicts now, because they were they were against the will of God. What happened to Israel? They fell into idolatry and many other things. And we find, just like we find in the armies and in the nations of the world today, they trusted more in the wealth that they had. They trusted in their soldiers by numbers. And they also trusted in the alliances that they had with idolatrous nations around them. And there's so many examples of where Israel lined up with someone who was, spiritually speaking, against God. And they would try to use that as a lever in their conflict with a different nation. Isn't it strange? Because our country, the U.S. today, aligns itself up with some terrible partners sometimes. And those things only result in the same kind of situation, even worse. But Israel gradually became more corrupt, and as they did, their ability to wage war was not in line with God's will anymore. And it finally came to its real end when the captivity was upon them. And Nebuchadnezzar's armies took Jerusalem. and they took them away. And so for 70 years, they were not even in their own land, so to speak, anymore. After the captivity, Israel no longer could wage a war. A different time, if you will, had started in. Whether they were right or wrong as a nation, they could no longer wage war or control any kind of conflict. For now they were ruled and governed over by other people. And that remains down to this time today. Israel is not her own, though she is within her borders and is recognized as such. The Gentiles still maintain their control over Israel. The only conflicts that happened under those early years were like the Maccabees, where they revolted against the ruling powers that were already in control. And sometimes these had some small successes, if you will, but never was there a complete and total victory like there was when God really fought for Israel. Never again. And so we have the basic ideas of what we might call as a holy war. It's holy because God has sanctioned it and has said this is what he wants, and it's his will to get rid of those who were contrary to his will to begin with. But there's another war we find mentioned in the Bible, and it's called the apocalyptic holy war. There are three elements that we find in that the prophets mention concerning this apocalyptic war. Number one is that Satan rules the whole world order. This is what we have today, isn't it? Number two is the eventual and certain end of that world order, which is to be brought by, of course, a holy war. We're talking of Revelation. We're all familiar with this. And the result of this war, or the end of it, will be complete peace when Jesus then takes and rules the whole world with a rod of iron in the hill. But that's different. The prophets of Israel spoke about in relation to Israel. And we find these mentioned in relation to Israel. And we find these mentioned in Isaiah, and Ezekiel, and Daniel. They spoke of this kind of a war. And so these are basically the two types of conflict that we find in the Scriptures. And so now we bring times up to the time of Jesus. And what did he say about wars? Well, we all know pretty well, don't we? Jesus' feeling. Jesus revealed the true causes of war. And it was right there within the individual. That was the real problem. And Jesus advocated a different kind of war. Jesus advocated the sword of the Spirit, as we read in Matthew 10, verses 34 to 39. Jesus displayed that quiet strength of the Spirit against any warlike feelings towards mankind. And if these kind of feelings were to be accepted universally throughout the earth, carnal warfare would be impossible. It would be totally impossible. But we see why the church now is opposed to carnal warfare, because this is what Jesus has instructed us. The warfare is taking an inward turn, not an outward turn. It's going to the heart. When Jesus said to love your enemies, to bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. Conditions like that are not brought about by guns and butter. No, they're brought about by humbleness and prayer. The body of Christ and warfare. Today, God is not building a nation as the world sees a nation. Not like he did with Israel in establishing grounds and boundaries and holding that ground. The only thing God is, as far as materially speaking, is he's regathering Israel and back into their land. That's what he's doing. Now, there may be conflicts going on which will accelerate or allow that kind of a gathering to go or to take place. And so certain conflicts that we see today, and I think of World War II, I think that's probably one of the greatest recent examples, were won or lost depending upon God's will as spoken in his holy word. Because Israel had to become a nation. It was necessary. And the events following World War II certainly accelerated that event. And it wasn't in 1948 when the final official proclamation, you might say, was given that Israel was considered as a nation once again. Although she still doesn't control, she is a nation and is recognized as such. But today, God is building something different. A spiritual priesthood is being built through the indwelling Holy Spirit of God in the true believer. We find this in Paul and James' words when they say, I see another law in my members warring against the law of my mind. This is the warfare that is brought to us today and to our attention. James says it in this way, from whence come wars and fightings among you? Come they not hence even of your lusts that war in your members? This is the warring situation that exists today in the body of Christ. Today, we are in the final time for the preparations of that great holy war, which will soon be taking place. All the evil that surfaces in this time that we witness on the television and everything else is all going to be taken care of. Is God involved in this holy war that is being prepared? He definitely is, 100%, and is proclaiming it through his word. And his people know it well. Personnel, yes, he has a leader chosen, Jesus Christ. There's no question about Jesus Christ being led by the Spirit of God. He will be the leader of this army in this holy war. The personnel will be the saints that follow him, as we read. You can read in Revelation 19. Again, we could go back to the 20th chapter of Deuteronomy and point out some things in there for ourselves to look at to see if we're going to meet the qualifications to be in that army. Have we allowed certain things to cause us to have a degree of unbelief? Because there can be no distractions in our hearts and minds. Jesus said, your whole body, in all of its entirety, he needs. And so as we prepare, this is what we have to think of. If we are to be part of the personnel in that military operation, in that holy war, the conduct of that war will be very swift and will be very decisive. There's no question the outcome of that conflict. I know that when I joined up some years ago in the service, and anyone else who did, you don't really know if you're coming back, even if it's peacetime. You don't really know what will take place during the 3 years you're in. But when it comes to this conflict, there is no question about somebody surviving. There is be no question at all. It's a guaranteed victory, and the result will be the 1,000-year reign of Jesus Christ in true peace and true tranquility, that which man has been seeking for generations. So with that in mind, we have the subject of war, basically, as the scriptures speak about it. There is nothing in the wars that take place today that we should support in the sense of taking part in it in any way, shape, or form. For soon will be that final war. And it's up to us just to be sure that we're on God's side and in His army, that we can partake of those wonderful things that He has in store for us at that time.